Okay, good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us today for our panel to discuss elections in Southeast and East Asia. In particular, we're going to be focusing on three elections, national elections. The parliamentary election in Thailand that was completed in May, in which voting took place in May, I believe the 14th of May. Taiwan's presidential election, which is due to be held on the 13th of January next year. And then Indonesia's presidential election, where voting will take place on the 14th of February. So I think we'll go in chronological order to just discuss some of the issues in play, both for domestic politics inside each of these states, and then also for their position internationally, and what that might mean in terms of spillover effects to other countries, or in terms indeed of the foreign policy of the countries concerned. So we'll go first to Dr. Tomas Larsson of Cambridge, who is going to talk a bit about Thai politics in the aftermath of last spring's momentous election.
All right, thank you very much, Bill. So I talked about this election at the Center for Geopolitics in June, a longer talk, so I'll try not to repeat myself here too much. And when I talked about the election at that point, we knew sort of what the election result was in arithmetical terms. We knew what the maths would be, but not what kind of government would be formed out of that new parliamentary setup. And we also didn't know whether, and this was a very important question at the time, whether Thaksin Shinawatra, the prime minister that had been ousted in a coup in 2006, would, as he had promised on Twitter, return to Thailand after many years in exile. And he had declared that he would come home to take care of his grandchildren. But now we know the outcome. So on the morning of Tuesday, the 22nd of August, so quite a few months after the actual election, Thaksin returned to Thailand, where he was arrested, taken to court, and then sent to prison. And a few hours later, the elected House of Representatives and the appointed Senate voted for Thaksin's political front man, Sethar Thavisin, as prime minister, as head of a grand coalition. And this was a grand coalition because it brought together political adversaries whose struggle over power had caused a great deal of turbulence in Thailand over the previous decade and a half, as different sort of forces mobilized street protests, red shirts versus yellow shirts, and that cycle interrupted also by various political coups, one in 2006 and one in 2014. So now a coalition was formed that included parties that represented different sides of this struggle, right? So on the sort of red shirt side, the Pheu Thai party, and that is associated with the Shinawatra family. And on the other hand, parties that were defenders of military and monarchical prerogatives who had staged these coups, toppling Shinawatra-led governments, and who subsequently had ruled as a military junta for 5 years between 2014 and 2019. And after that, after the election in 2019, as head of with the two generals there, Prawit and Prayut, Prayut Chan-o-cha and Prawit Wongsuwan. They ruled as head of this elected government as leaders of a party called Palang Pracharat. So the formation of this new ruling coalition promised to sort of redraw the lines of conflict that had defined Thai politics for the previous 15 years or so. So one might argue that we're witnessing essentially a new era in Thai politics. And in light of the polarization of Thai society and Thai politics that had preceded this election, this outcome might seem rather surprising. But close observers of Thai politics had seen the writing on the wall. So a year ago, in October, November 2022, the gossip in Bangkok was that Pheu Thai and the main military party would form a coalition after the election. So it's not entirely surprising. Some carefully laid plans were, however, sort of upended or temporarily faced an obstacle because the election campaign didn't go as planned. Pheu Thai wanted to have a landslide. They didn't get one. Since 2001, Shinawatra-aligned parties have always become the largest party in parliament. This time around, they became only the second largest party in parliament. The winner, so to speak, of the election was a new progressive radical party, the Move Forward Party, who campaigned on the promise of, if you vote for us, you won't have to see the two uncles, that is to say, the generals that had essentially dominated Thai politics over the previous decade almost by that time. So that generated a lot of enthusiasm amongst voters who were very much sick and tired, it appeared, of these gentlemen. So the question we might then ask is, so the Move Forward Party was successful in the election, and they had a first go at forming a coalition government which included Pheu Thai. But various extra-parliamentary institutions and some parliamentary institutions in the form of the appointed Senate, the Election Commission, the constitutional courts, etc., essentially threw spanners in the works for Move Forward to form a government. So they were forced, or manipulated, you could say, machinated out of a realistic prospect of that. So they didn't succeed, and instead Pheu Thai was allowed to form a government, and with this grand coalitions then. So one of the questions one might ask then is whether or not this coalition, which represent a redrawing of the lines of political conflict, is a stable one or a temporary one. I do think my hunch, so to speak, is that the Pheu Thai party faces serious challenges. This deal that they made with their former rivals and opponents has made their core supporters rather disenchanted with them. So they've lost a lot of credibility amongst the sort of staunchest grassroots supporters. And the question is whether or not they can continue to do very well in elections. The historical records suggest that they might face a difficulty. A number of parties have kind of positioned themselves as the party of the establishment protecting the iron triangle of palace, military, and big business, which is kind of the role that Pheu Thai has now taken upon itself to do. Previous parties that have done this, the Democrat Party, for example, and indeed the military proxy party, Palang Pracharat itself, they have dwindling support, right? So they take on this role and they lose support in the process. And this points the finger at something that I think explains quite a lot about Thai politics, which is that, and the cycle of coups and elections that recur in Thai politics, which is that Thailand has never had an enduring, electorally successful conservative political party, right? The equivalent sort of the Tory party here. So that the question, I guess, in a sense, is whether or not Pheu Thai will succeed in transforming itself into the party of sort of conservatism and remain electorally successful. The tricky path they have to negotiate here is that they have, in the past decade, presented themselves sort of as a champion of democracy or something like that. And now that they are becoming the defenders of the status quo, that becomes much more difficult to do. So they have pivoted towards essentially the origins of the Pheu Thai party before the 2005 coup, when they campaigned very much on economic prosperity, bringing economic prosperity to Thailand. So they have an economic kind of performance agenda. That's what they want to achieve here, and that's how they see a future for themselves as looking ahead to the next election, right? And that will also then drive, I think, a great deal of what this new government does in terms of its foreign relations. Everything will be geared towards expanding trade, attracting investment. The sort of wet dream of the new government is to get Elon Musk to relocate, the production base for Teslas to Thailand, right? And if they can do something like that, and maybe they can gain back some the enthusiasm that it used to be able to generate. I think I'll stop there and let others.
Okay, thank you very much. Who wants to go first? Okay, so next up we have Dr. Trini Lee, who is Associate Professor at University of Nottingham, who's going to talk a bit about Taiwan and the presidential election there and what it means for Taiwan politics looking ahead.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for having me here. I have to confess to the audience and the panelists that I'm not an election expert. I'm a more of the cross-strait person. But I would like to just to provide my observation of the China's impact on Taiwan's election, and then Professor Defferfeld will be able to get into more depth of the nitty-gritty parts of the Taiwan elections. And I also just to connect with our previous panelist, Thomas, you just mentioned about economic prosperity. And actually, this is one of the key reasons of the recent election in Taiwan, of that China has been trying to influence of the Taiwanese voters that voting for the more pro-China party, that is KMT, would ensure more of the long or perspective future of the Taiwan's economic development. I just provide my observation of the comparing of the 2020 and the current upcoming 2024 presidential election. In 2020, actually, there was more of the populism candidate of the KMT. Some of you probably heard of it, of the Han wave, Han Kuo-yu. He is more of closer to, if you would like allow me to make this very simplistic comparison to former President Trump or any populist figure, it's very direct language to the people and attract people to his strategy that is open up to China further and would bring more of the economic prosperity to Taiwan, because as you would probably understand, Taiwan is a developed country that already reached to a limit of development for some time prior COVID. Yeah? And in that sense, that at the time, actually Han Kuo-yu was the KMT candidate, is a pro-China party candidate, has had a rather long or kind of miraculously support from the grassroots, especially for the people who have not really benefit from, if you like, it's kind of similar to all the populism story, people who have not really benefit from the globalization. There are also people who are not really benefit from the economic integration, all that, and have this kind of resentment of the governments that didn't do much for them. That is in Taiwan. And for that reason, that Han Kuo-yu at the time, he won 2018 Kaohsiung mayor election, and then with that kind of the strong support from Kaohsiung, which was kind of not normal because Kaohsiung is a city, the second biggest city in Taiwan who's supposed to be green or support DPP city. But Han Kuo-ri turned the fact and became the elected mayor. And with that kind of the support, he then declared that he would go for the presidential election for 2020. At the time of the 2018, 2019, most of the people or observers, although had really wary or skepticism of this kind of populist figure, we don't want really to be like America, right? So really wary that if he would be able to elect, then what Taiwan would look like. But it's a very interesting trick for our twist in my observation, that is to say, Han, this populist figure, KMT's candidate, he was more of promising economic prosperity. And with that, because he wants to have more of the trade with mainland China, with that he has sort of getting quite a lot of support previously. But the turning point actually happened in 2019 after the national security law crackdown in Hong Kong. Han, actually, this candidate didn't really have much of sympathy for most of the Hong Kongese people and didn't really have the vision to say that Taiwan would welcome and Taiwan support Hong Kong. And it's that turning point it was that turning point the current President Tsai Ing-wen had started to get more of the vote and had a landscape victory result at the end. So I was just providing this very quick and simple twist to say in 2020, at the time of China impact, of course, is based on the economic prosperity, no longer on the missile threat to Taiwan. In the past, China always would have the military exercise during the presidential election or close to presidential election to Taiwan. They knew that it doesn't work. It couldn't work more or couldn't be more effective to the Taiwanese voters. But then they started to use this economic strategy or economic statecraft. And then they did have a presidential candidate who would be more close to China, as I mentioned, Han Kuo-yu, KMT candidate. But because of these unfortunate events happened in Hong Kong 2019 national security law crackdown, that result, Taiwanese voters, especially younger generation, realize if we elect these populist figure promising our economic prosperity, we probably will end up as Hong Kong, with all due sympathy and respect that Taiwan do not want to or does not want to end up we think like Hong Kong and under China's no sympathy or no democratic rule. And that's why I think at the time that the turning point happened in 2020 and the current President Tsai actually had the landscape winning in 2020 presidential election. Now, with 4 years, I spent quite a lot of time to talk about China impact in the past election. I used the 2020 election as an example. With 4 years situation now, we are looking at 2024. I would say, in my observation, the impact of China to Taiwan's election actually is very minimal. For the reason that it's not just because the economic prosperity can't be guaranteed by the Chinese. Taiwanese, especially after COVID, realized that China is not just an authoritarian country. It's a country doesn't really. It's not just an authoritarian country. Does not give Hong Kong compatriots their space for their 50 years democracy or 50 years self-rule zone, but also the Chinese government actually is very cruel to their own citizens during COVID. So what Taiwan have seen that Chinese government have done actually spoke quite well. And China has not much of the soft power or means or hard power, if you like. They can deploy as many as possible the fighter jets or missile over Taiwan Strait. But the effect always actually is counter effect. It always pushes the voters more into the party who is not really support Chinese government, the DPP party. So military-wise, they have no means to deploy, and economic-wise, unfortunately, Taiwanese have already gave up the hope that prosperity is laying on China. Taiwanese understand that the prosperity actually created by Taiwan themselves, and even more so, especially after the trade war in 2018. There's a lot of the alternative and a lot of the decoupling. Although I say decouple, I understand that's not so easy to be decoupled, but alternate trade investments and alternate economic relationship, not just with China, but with all the other countries. So I think from my observation, China has been really to its own ends, trying to having any means to influence on Taiwan. But it doesn't mean that Taiwan's election doesn't have any other concerns or issues or troubles. My thought would just to say that I can say the Chinese influence is not that strong comparatively to the past presidential election if we look into this year. But I have a question, also I have an unsure issue is, although I can say economic-wise, military-wise, China cannot intimidate Taiwanese voters, but Chinese government and also Chinese netizens are very good in deploy this information. And that is still a quite worry for most of the Taiwanese citizen organizations or the watchers, because it is very difficult to actually counter. Although Taiwan has cold facts and also verification of the information, but there are some big holes that there to be influenced by the disinformation. And I think that I would just end here, and David will be able to provide more of the closer watch or observation of the elections in Taiwan.
Great, thank you very much. Next we have Professor David Fell of SOAS, University of London.
So as a long-term observer of Taiwanese elections, I have to admit that I think this election is very, very difficult to predict. We're coming to the end of the current ruling party, the DPP's second presidential term. And if we compare this second presidential term to previous equivalents of where we are now, Taiwan looks extremely different. Based on past precedent, we would expect the ruling party to lose in January of 2024, and also to lose very badly. And we've seen that in the previous 4 cases, in 2000, 2008, and 2016. But currently, if we look at the where the opinion polls, look at the current opinion polls, the current ruling party is actually leading the polls. Many observers, we had a think tank panel a couple of weeks ago at SOAS, and they were predicting that the DPP was going to win. Personally, I still think a change of ruling parties is possible. But the fact that the DPP is leading the polls at the moment, I think, is quite different from what we've seen in the past. If we look at the realm of party identification, again, if we look at the previous cases, the ruling party was very unpopular. We saw that in 2008, 2016, and also we saw very large-scale anti-government social movements in 2006 and 2014 that contributed to landslide defeats of the ruling party. But we don't see anything like that. There's no large anti-government social movements currently. If we look at the current ruling party, its party identification has actually been pretty high in the second term, which is again something that we haven't seen in previous cases. If we look at the main opposition party, the Kuomintang, the KMT, its party identification has actually been quite low throughout this current term. There's a few kind of slight increases. And again, that's previously the opposition party was very popular at this stage. Another thing that makes this campaign different is the fact that we have seemingly a relevant third party, the Taiwan People's Party. This is the first time that a third party has looked like it could challenge one of the mainstream parties since perhaps 2001, 2002. One of the things I think we need to pay close attention to, and I think Taiwanese media is whether or not we'll see some kind of cooperation between the two opposition parties. Can we see a joint ticket between the KMT and the TVP? And of course, Terry Gore is our other potential candidate. Can they find some way of cooperating? We've not seen a joint ticket, presidential ticket, since 2004. But again, that was quite different. In 2004, the joint ticket was announced in March of that campaign. While currently now we're just about a month or so away from the registration of candidates. So again, this brings a lot of uncertainty. Currently, polls tell us that if there is a joint ticket, they should win. But again, that's very different. Polls said that the joint ticket would win in 2004, but that didn't happen. The next thing I think we should pay a lot of attention to in this campaign is the parliamentary election. Too much of the focus is on the presidency. I think the parliament, even if the DP wins the presidency, I think it's quite possible that we'll end up with a hung parliament. So even if, let's say, William Lai wins, he's going to be very constrained in what he can do, as we saw when we had divided government between 2000 and 2008. So here, again, a couple of things I think we should pay attention to. One is, will the two opposition parties cooperate on the parliamentary election? I think that is actually a lot easier to do than the presidential cooperation. That could be very effective. A further thing to look at is, because the two elections are held on the same day, parliamentary and presidential on the same day, there's normally a big coattail effect. So will we see the presidential candidates dragging up their parliamentary candidates, or could it be the opposite? If we look back to the case that Juni talked quite a lot about, the 2020 election, the DP presidential candidate brought up her parliamentary candidates, while Han Kuo-yu dragged their party candidates down. A fifth thing that I think is quite interesting and different from previous campaigns is the position of civil society-based political parties. Last time when I was here a year ago, I talked about the Green Party, which is an example of such a civil society-based party. Since 2012, we've seen these civil society-based parties increasingly competitive. The New Power Party, the Social Democratic Party, the State Building Party. However, and many of these had their roots in the Sunflower Movement of 2014. However, in the last couple of years, we've seen a decline in support level of these actors, despite the fact that they brought something quite special to Taiwan's party system, representing civil society groups, representing neglected issues, such as same-sex marriage is a good example. At the moment, it looks possible that none of these civil society-based parties will stay in Parliament in 2024. They seemingly have failed to cooperate, which has been a big mistake. But I think there's also other factors. For example, the DP has been very successful at poaching key figures or human resources from these civil society groups and parties. And that's really undermined their strength. And maybe let me just add one final thing that I think we should keep an eye on. And that's, I think we still don't know what is going to be the most salient or influential issues in this election. And that's quite strange so late in the campaign. As Junie mentioned, in 2020, China was the number one issue, China and Hong Kong. But that's not always the case. Often my fellow Taiwanese political scientists put all the stress on cross-strait relations. But if we look back at the previous changes of ruling parties, it's often been other issues. For example, in 2000, the key issue was political corruption. In 2008, it was a mixture of political corruption as well as a critique of economic performance. And in 2016, it was a mixture of social movements, civil society related topics. Who wins the election? I think one of the key variables is going to be what is the most salient issue and which party owns that issue. In 2020, the DPP really owned the China issue. It was favorable for them. But we just have to wait and see what is going to be the dominant issue in this campaign. And I think it won't necessarily be China. And I think it was really interesting, the point you made about the fact that it looks like China isn't going to be as influential as previous campaigns. But I think there's also a bit of uncertainty. There's always that possibility that it could reignite again.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to talk just a little bit then about Indonesia and its upcoming presidential election in February. In order to do that, though, I think it's important to say a little bit about the background to this election, which is very complex and lengthy and is often skipped over if we look at sort of things in the press about world's third largest democracy, et cetera, which are not necessarily inaccurate, but oftentimes too superficial or not contextualized. So if we go all the way back after declaring independence in 1945 and then finally driving the Dutch out for good in 1949, Indonesia had a kind of very turbulent period of politics up until really for the next 20 years, let's say, but in different forms dominated by the personality of its founding president, Sukarno, right, between 1945, let's say, and 1965. And throughout this period in different forms, Sukarno and those in conflict with Sukarno really drove political change in the system. Until on the night of the 30th of September, 1965, a number of leading generals were assassinated. And a coup and then counter-coup took place over the next couple of days that brought into power a new military leadership under General Suharto, who by 1966-67, after a period of massive violence, social violence as well as just elite violence, managed to solidify control and consolidate a new regime that became known as the New Order. And over the 1970s and 80s, the New Order regime regularized a kind of politics in which elections happened, but most people would recognize the system as being fundamentally authoritarian. And so it's a unitary presidential system, unitary republic under a presidential system, in which during that time period there were only 3 political parties, really 2 parties in one group permitted. Right? There was the PPP, which was meant to represent more religiously oriented or inflected voters, the PDI, which was meant to be sort of secular democratic party, and then the ruling group, which was called Golkar, literally the functional groupings, that was supposed to be the catch-all for everything, kind of corporatist umbrella party. And Golkar dominated elections all the way through the 1970s, 1980s, into the 1990s. When we get to sort of the end stage of New Order, after about 1995, 1996, through Suharto's eventual downfall in 1998, what we started to see happening were 2 things. First of all, more of an upsurge of support for new kinds of political movements, but also splits within those parties that existed, right? Most importantly, the split inside the PDI between 2 factions, one of which remained sort of more pro-status quo, and the other of which came to be led by the daughter of the founding president, Sukarno, Megawati Soekarno-Putri, and was more in support of criticism or change of regime at that point. And so then eventually by 1998, when protests had broken out, when the economy was in very, very serious crisis following the so-called Asian financial crisis of 97, 1998, and Suharto was away in Egypt on a foreign trip, eventually a change of government occurred. Now, that's often been characterized by many people in the literature as a quote-unquote inside job, because what happened was, despite the mass movement and the protests against Suharto, a group of existing elites got together and decided on the format of the transfer. And so Suharto resigned and was replaced by his vice president, Habibie, right? And Habibie was hardly an outsider. In 1999, there was set to be an election anyway. There was an election. The election did not result in a clear majority for any one candidate, but because of the format, which at that time was still indirect, you voted for a party under proportional representation system, and then essentially Parliament would elect the president from among its choices throughout the parties. Other parties maneuvered in Parliament to make sure that the top vote getter, and her party, which was Megawati Sukarnoputri, was the top vote getter, was not elected as president. Instead, the leader of a different party, the PKB, which is or became the leader of that party, had been the head of the Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the largest Islamic organization in Indonesia, and a more conservative religious leader, was actually elected as president through an alliance of other parties against Megawati. Of course, Megawati didn't like this, and there was a lot of sort of machinations behind the scenes. Megawati became the vice president in a compromise because she was the top vote getter and the number 2 vote getter among parliamentarians casting the actual final votes electorally. There were a lot of machinations behind the scenes that led eventually to the impeachment of Abdurrahman Wahid Gustur and his replacement then by Megawati. Finally, we get to 2004. And why all this background? You'll see in a second. The other thing that, of course, happened in 1998 that I didn't mention just now, in the context of the end game of New Order, large incidents of mass violence broke out in Jakarta and also elsewhere, but most spectacularly in Jakarta. And military units, in some cases, were tied to some of this violence, including units under the command of Prabowo Subianto, who was a general who was quite close to Suharto and his family. So close was Prabowo to some of these violent incidents that he decided to leave the country afterwards for some time, and several countries around the world basically deemed him persona non grata, and in some cases leveled charges against him as having liability for violence and murder. Fast forward again to 2004. When we come into 2004 election, a change had been made such that now elections would be direct. There would be no more of this indirect process of voting for parliament, who would then appoint the president. And so in this first direct election, we saw Megawati and her party, the sort of splinter party from the PDI, the PDIP, there's another PDI, but it was sort of withering, running against a panoply of candidates. Right? There were a whole bunch of candidates who declared from all different political perspectives. Right? So there were more conservative religious candidates, there were military candidates, there were a whole bunch of different people. But the one who proved most successful was an ex-general who had been security minister, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who succeeded in getting the most votes and eventually winning the election outright, and became president then for 2 terms of 5 years until 2014. Right? He won in 2004, then he won again in 2009 in a less hotly contested election, and was re-elected for another 5 years. Now, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, or SBY as he's often known, was also hardly an outsider. Right? He was also a general. He was also somebody who had been quite close to Suharto. He had been a minister in Megawati's cabinet. Right? So again, we saw this kind of existing elite coming through. And then in 2014, something slightly different happened. Right? Because Megawati had been controlling her party in the same way that SBY had been controlling his new party, the Democratic Party, or that others controlled their parties almost as personal fiefdoms. Right? Political parties in Indonesian politics became rather like sort of personal vehicles for particular individual elites. And to some extent that broke in 2014. We saw a kind of meteoric rise of a politician who had been a sort of local politician in Central Java, in Solo and a couple other places in Central Java, and then moved to Jakarta and became governor there, and then ran for president, in some ways without the full backing of Megawati. Right? He wasn't really her protege in the way that others within the party were. And he was Joko Widodo, who then did end up winning the election in 2014 in a very, very tight election, which I'll come back to in a second, and then was re-elected in a much less close election in 2019. In both of those elections, his primary opponent was one person, Prabowo Subianto, the general from 1998, who returned to Indonesian politics and established a new party in the 2000s called Gerindra. Now, Gerindra is interesting in many ways, and I won't talk too much about its ideology because we actually have a populism panel in about 3 or 4 weeks, and on which this will be discussed in much more detail. But for lack of a better characterization, Gerindra is a right-wing populist party. It's not just a right-wing populist party, it is probably the most organized political party in Indonesia. It has party organizations down to every local level. It's very, very tightly organized and hierarchically organized. It has tremendous economic and personnel resources, and is more disciplined than most of the other parties. And sort of loosely, it basically just means the movement to make Indonesia great again, in a sense, right? Is it literally kind of what it's trying to be, the movement for great Indonesia. And you know, it plays on all of the sort of touchstones of right-wing populist movements elsewhere around the world. It also represents a rather odd coalition, right? It has in its coalition military people and supporters of the old military regime, and others sort of politically of an authoritarian bent. It also has reached out rather successfully over its time in existence to a lot of conservative religious parties, right, so-called Islamist parties or Islamically inflected parties, and other groups. And then finally, it's made a very successful series of inroads into the labor movement of all things. And it's actually co-opted a lot of leading labor unions in a number of important cities. And so this mass base has also had a rather effective appeal, because Prabowo is also an excellent speaker, unlike a lot of other right-wing populists that we find. Right? Han Kuo-yu is not a good speaker, in my view. His speeches are not inspiring when you listen to them. Right? Donald Trump, Boris Johnson, these are not, inspiring speakers. Prabowo is, especially if you like what he has to say, which many people did. But he's a very, very good speaker and an effective political presence in a way, actually, that a lot of Indonesian politicians have not been. And so this political movement, this new political party, was extraordinarily successful, particularly in certain parts of the country. And we can see this, and we can get into this in the question and answer if you want, in West Java especially, and in certain other provinces. It's been very, very successful. He nearly won in 2014. Up until the election, I was taking bets with other political scientists who like to study Indonesia, and their opinions were split. In fact, I would say most people thought Prabowo was going to win. I didn't, actually. I thought Widodo was going to win. But it was a very close election and not at all clear until the very end who was going to win in 2014. Joko Widodo came in and initiated massive economic reform policies, really the most important economic reform policies in at least a generation, of eliminating the fuel subsidies, but then also extending social welfare programs with the savings in the budget from that, as well as then also a large-scale investment program in infrastructure. Those economic and social policies have been very successful, broadly speaking. There have been problems, but they have been quite successful. He's proven to be extraordinarily popular over his entire term in office, which is why he was re-elected in 2019, again against Prabowo, but in a much less close election. After that, though, he did something that I find a little bit perplexing, and that maybe is typical of certain kinds of calculations, but struck many people strangely. He co-opted Prabowo into the government. Yes, as a member of the cabinet, actually, and made an alliance with him in the parliament, because Prabowo controlled the largest coalition in the parliament. And so it was very useful to continue legislating, but it meant that Prabowo became a kind of natural heir in many ways. It was very difficult to completely block him out when the campaign season began to heat up again. And of course, here we are now, right? Prabowo has declared his candidacy early, and he is definitely among the leading candidates, if not the leading candidate right now, heading into the electoral season. In addition, the PDIP, right, Joko Widodo's party, has had a rather interesting internal struggle. Again, kind of between different factions, including factions tied to the ex-president Megawati, right? And the incumbent has said, I don't want to interfere, I'm going to be completely hands-off, but it's not clear how happy he is with the result of the nomination process. The person nominated is the mayor of Surakarta in Central Java, right? Ganjar Pranowo, not Prabowo, right? So different, very different person, completely different kind of politician. And he is very much the kind of elder statesman of a sort of secular social democracy type of strand in the party. But it's not clear if he has the full support of the incumbent administration or all of the factions within the PDIP. He has chosen as his running mate a very famous legal scholar and former justice on the court, Mahfoud Md, who is, by most indications, somewhat more conservative, I would say, or has a more conservative appeal, certainly than Ganjar, but is also somebody who's supported by a lot of more kind of progressive voters around the country. And so that's one ticket. Prabowo is there, but he hasn't, just yesterday they registered, by the way, on the 19th of October when registration opened. Prabowo has not yet registered, and I'll come back to that in a second. Another candidate has registered yesterday as well, Anies Baswedan. Anies Baswedan is a rather odd candidate because he's a US-trained political scientist who is very, very skillful at sort of cynically moving to where he thinks the median voter is. He's studied well different theories of Arrow and so on to figure out how to get to that point, and sort of cultivated a reputation as a rather sort of progressive figure for a long time. And then in 2017, when he ran for governor of Jakarta, played rather nasty politics in terms of activating religious and ethnic prejudice and also sort of igniting a very, very strong movement of extraordinarily conservative religious voters, in addition to sort of anti-Chinese Indonesian bias, sort of playing on those things to win the election in 2017 in Jakarta. He's now declared his candidacy as an independent candidate. Right? He doesn't really have a political party. He just registered yesterday as well, and he has appointed as his vice presidential running mate Muhaimin Iskandar, who is the head of the PKB, Abdurrahman Wahid's old party, right, and a very conservative religious leader as well. In addition, Anies has appealed and reached out to another coalition partner of his from parliament, the PKS, which is a more hardline conservative religious party. And so he's clearly trying to appeal to this constituency, which isn't inconsiderable in Indonesian politics, but it's nowhere near a majority. Right? There's a sort of ceiling of maybe 20% that you could really get from that constituency alone. And so if you make that your base, you have to be careful not to alienate the rest of the voters, or else you'll top out at somewhere like 20-25% of the vote. Finally, we have Prabowo. Prabowo has not registered yet, as far as I know, unless he registered today, which I haven't seen, but I don't think he did. He hasn't officially chosen his vice presidential running mate, but on Monday, the Constitutional Court, which is controlled largely by the brother-in-law of the incumbent president, right, Joko Widodo's brother-in-law, has ruled that it is okay for Joko Widodo's eldest son to enter presidential politics, even though he's below the constitutionally minimum age to do so. Right? I believe he's 36 and you're supposed to be 40. And so the court has said it's okay. And so there's a lot of strong speculation that Prabowo may try to choose the incumbent president's son in a move to co-opt support from the current administration and the faction within the PDIP that supports it. So we don't know if that's going to happen. We don't know what will happen if that happens. But there's a lot of uncertainty sort of swirling around that. More broadly, if we look to the election then in February, can any one of these three win a majority? I'm not sure. In fact, I think probably not. My guess will be that no one can get the majority, that Anies and Prabowo will basically split the very conservative religious vote and some others, that Ganjar will consolidate all of those people who are afraid of Prabowo and Anies, as well as sort of more progressive secular elements, in particularly Central Java, East Java, but that there won't be a majority. Anies will probably have to drop out into the runoff, and then we'll have a runoff between Prabowo and Ganjar. Who wins that runoff? I have no idea. And I think a lot of it will depend on turnout in certain regions, as we often see in Indonesian presidential politics. All right, if there's higher turnout in West Java than in Central Java, East Java, that would be very good for Prabowo, very bad for Ganjar. If the reverse is true, we'd see the opposite. Likewise, for populous provinces outside Java, like North Sumatra and South Sulawesi, those provinces have less straightforward political coalitions sometimes that can come into play. It's not clear what turnout will be, and it's not clear who will win that. So broadly speaking, if Ganjar wins the election, let's say, Indonesia will probably remain more or less on course with where it is. And the major foreign policy question, in my view, will be how it triangulates between China and other regional powers looking to exert influence in Southeast Asia. And this has been the key foreign policy question the last couple of years for the Joko Widodo administration as well, right? If Prabowo wins, I really have no idea what kind of foreign policy Indonesia will pursue. It will be quite interesting to see. If Anies wins, I think there could be serious political implications inside Indonesia. I don't know how stable Indonesian politics would be, but I don't think he's going to win. I'd be so surprised by that win. It would take such a disruption, I think, to have that happen, that it would be sort of an aberration in and of itself. So it's likely that we're headed into another interesting cycle in which existing elites come back into the game again. Even though for the last 10 years or so, it looked like existing elites were kind of dropping off the stage. Likewise, it really will be important to see whether or not this kind of new right-wing populism of Prabowo will actually carry the day or be sidelined more or less for good, perhaps for quite a while longer, right, if he loses a third time in this election. And finally, whether that ceiling of 20 to 25% of very conservative religious voters can be broken by Anies or others with that sort of an agenda, or whether that ceiling is even lower now than it appeared to be in the past, because we haven't really seen a candidate try to mobilize that particular constituency in quite a while. I'll stop there. I've talked way too long. Let's give all the other panelists a chance to respond very briefly, if they want, to anything that we've all said, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Anyone want to respond at all to anything?
Maybe could I respond to one of your points? I found it really interesting the way you were talking about the kind of Indonesia under Suharto. It kind of reminded me almost of Taiwan under martial law. And I was curious about why didn't Golkar, hasn't it been as successful as, let's say, the KMT after transition? Did it concede too late? Did it fail to build up organization? Because despite being, often my students are really confused about the KMT. The fact that we have so much, so many kind of human rights violations under martial law, it's actually quite a competitive party, and it could easily come back to power in 2024.
The short answer is Golkar split. It split into all these different factions, and there were really no viable leaders from within Golkar that made much traction during the 2000s and beyond.
Okay, so there wasn't really that kind of party identity.
Yeah, I mean, it's still there, and it had been still there as a significant electoral force in the parliament and potentially in presidential elections until quite recently, but it's basically off the scene now. Jean?
Just quickly, just feel like uncertainty is the similarity of Indonesia and Taiwan's election. And I also was reflecting on what David just asked about the question. But in fact, I feel like in any democracies, it would be good to have alternate governments. And in Taiwan's case, I think we often just to think KMT and DPP. But maybe the time comes to have a different party. And in any democracy, now with Indonesia's case, as the three is unpredictable, but less good. In terms of the healthy part of the democracy is developing. And of course, I understand that the DPP is more for the human rights and everything, but for Taiwan, I still think alternative governments would be better for the democracy's development. And it's just now, I also don't see there will be, in this election, I don't see there will be a really strong challenging party to the current government's party. And that is a slight worry from my end, yeah.
And just to respond to Jean's, just one point, I think that one of the problems with this main opposition party is it's really struggled to learn lessons of defeat. I think in the past it reformed much more effectively when it did come back to power, and I think that's definitely an issue. Sorry, Thomas, go.
So I thought there were many resonances between Bill's picture of Indonesian politics, and there's one thought that struck me in particular was his. So I talked about sort of a grand coalition in Thailand, and it sounds like Prabowo and Jokowi's son is a kind of a grand coalition, or at least, some kind of merging of opponents and melding and mixing. And some political scientists, I think, have referred to this kind of tendency in Indonesian politics as something like, what is it, promiscuous power sharing or something like that, right? So that might be a theme that we see in at least some of the Southeast Asian elections here as part of the outcomes here.
And one thing I think that's interesting about sort of the difference between both Indonesia and Thailand on the one hand and Taiwan on the other, I think the parties are much weaker in Southeast Asia than in Northeast Asia, broadly speaking. And so the party system is much less consolidated, and the personal influence of particular politicians is much higher. And shifting coalitions of parties are more common, I think, in Southeast Asian democracies than in East Asia or Northeast Asia. And then also regional divides are incredibly pronounced. They are in Taiwan too, actually, between North and South, and between the East and the West of Taiwan as well. So, but I think that there are interesting commonalities there as well as a contrast. But let's open the floor quickly for some questions. Any questions? No.
My question is about American foreign policy impacts on Taiwanese domestic politics, if Nancy Pelosi's visit had an impact, and if there's U.S. growing focus on Ukraine and Israel will perhaps have any impact on Taiwanese domestic politics.
You go first on that one, yes.
Americans' impact on Taiwan's domestic politics, of course, is huge. Last year, August, Pelosi's visit was very, very sort of put Taiwan onto the hotspot. Domestically, I think that the general feedback would be that Taiwan would, of course, welcome Pelosi and the support of the Pelosi's visit. There's no way that Taiwan would say no to that. But to the election, I think this is a point that you would like to know, is I think the voters are still thinking or wondering whether U.S.'s support to Taiwan to what extent, right? But we can't pin the U.S. support down now because there's no conflict happening, yeah? And this is the point that I think the example you mentioned about of the Ukraine and also Israeli and the Gaza conflicts, they are good, but I think more to the point actually is U.S. retreat from Afghanistan. That to Taiwan was a little bit of the blow, and was worried that whether U.S. would not care for Taiwan. But there's also another voice to say the reason U.S. retreat from Afghanistan because they want to focus solely on China, and less for Taiwan more comfort, to feel like U.S. of course they have limited resource and they really want to focus on, and less align with Biden government's their home in that sense.
Yeah, I just had a couple of thoughts on your question. I think the US, if it's not confident in a Taiwanese presidential candidate, usually we will hear hints about this. I think it's concerned when candidates are seen as being too keen on pushing Taiwan independence, or they're too pro-China. If we go back, let's say, to the 2020 campaign, the US was definitely not confident in one of the potential DPP candidates. And we were hearing that. That's right. Although he's actually the candidate now, but I think that he's moderated quite a lot. So I think that's, I'm not hearing those kind of same concerns from US think tank people. And I think similarly there have been KMT potential candidates in the past. If we go back to 2016, the aborted KMT candidate, the US definitely wasn't confident in her. And we saw that in the DP candidate of 2012. We saw those kind of hints. If we go back to the Pelosi visit, it didn't seem to have a huge impact on the elections that were held a few months later. It turned out to be very, very domestic focused.
Other questions? In the back.
On the question of Indonesia's potential Chinese foreign policy, you mentioned earlier that the infrastructures projects that Joko Widodo has been embracing have been largely successful and maybe to an extent even popular. I'm curious if there's been a groundswell of any popular resistance against anti-Chinese sentiment or environmental concerns or debt that candidates might choose to tap into as the election progresses, or is that largely absent?
There's been a lot of debate over a number of years in Indonesian politics about whether it's a good idea to partner with China on infrastructure projects or not. And there have been some that have been rather successful that have happened under partnership with China through different initiatives, and some others that have been canceled or blocked because of the potential partnership with China. And in fact, more costly alternatives were chosen in some cases to avoid working with China or Chinese companies on certain infrastructure projects. The pendulum, I think, has basically now swung, at least in terms of the incumbent administration, in favor of more partnership with China rather than less. That it's better to get these things accomplished that way rather than to hold it up for different reasons or go for costlier alternatives. There have been a number of controversies around labor regulations, Chinese workers being employed in Indonesia without the correct visas, for example, or being employed in conditions that do not meet the standards of Indonesian labor law. There have been stories about displacement of Indonesian residents of different places, villagers mostly, in rural areas, being displaced from infrastructure projects. There have been environmental problems, projects not meeting standards and scandals around pollution. Not only in projects involving working with China, I should say. There have been some massive environmental catastrophes with wholly domestic projects in certain cases, notably involving mining and also in projects that involved other countries like the United States. There have also been environmental and other social issues around that for a long time. So it's not unique to working with China, but yes, China-connected projects have had major issues in the last few years. And it is a political issue, it is a significant social issue. I don't know that there's a clear consensus one way or the other in popular opinion, and I don't know that there is going to be a major electoral issue made of this in the campaign. I'm curious to see that, actually. I haven't seen it so far. But I also don't know what a new administration would do for any of these three candidates. I assume that if Ganjar wins, it's quite likely that he'd continue with policies broadly similar to Joko Widodo's policies, but I don't know that in this particular area. For the other two candidates, I really have no idea. And I could see arguments of how they would go more closely into partnership with China on many initiatives, and other arguments as to why they would not wish to work with China at all, and actually why the Chinese government might not want to work with them, in fact, in both cases for different reasons. So I don't know, because no one has said this, and it's not clear exactly which arguments will hold sway in those decisions. But it's a good question, and we'll see what happens.
So I have two questions on Taiwan, if I may. So firstly, Chunyi, you mentioned that there is a very strong populist vote of Han Kuo-yu in 2020. So where do you think those votes will go in this election, whether it's KMT, or do they actually turn out to vote because there is no kind of populist candidate this time? And then secondly, David, you mentioned that there's a lack of salient issues in election this time. Why do you think that is the case for this election, and who is benefiting from this lack of issues?
Before you answer, let's see if there's one more question. We could take a final question from the floor before. Yes, in the back.
Hi, this is on Thailand. I was just wondering if you can, Professor Larsson, if you can expand a bit more on kind of the public sentiment towards the current administration. We haven't heard much on that, and I understand that they have just started that term. But it would be interesting, because as someone who's watching Thai politics quite closely, I kind of expected that there would be some sort of protest breaking out after the Move Forward party was blocked, and that Srettha became the prime minister, kind of just installed from the above. So, but there hasn't really been any mass protests, and I wonder why, and related to public sentiment. Thank you.
Great. Why don't we answer those in order, and then we can move to the reception.
Well, thanks, Adrian, for the question. No, I think they would still vote. They wouldn't say that there's no populist candidate and they don't vote. And in my observation, Daphne can of course correct me. Those hardcore Han fans, supporters to Han Kuo-yu, they would divide there would be a division of their vote, in a sense. There were some of them probably go to Guo Taiming, if Guo Taiming would actually get the seat. Some of them still, they are KMT's hardcore supporters, so they would go for KMT. I don't really think they will go to TPP. I don't think they will vote for the KP, but I think it would be some of them stay with the KMT, and some of them vote for Guo Taiming, if Guo Taiming can cross the threshold.
Let me just kind of also add a few words. I think the KMT is trying very hard to get Han involved in their campaign. And my KMT friends believe that Han does still have the potential to play an important role. A lot of his supporters are attracted not only by his personality, but I think it's also the fact that he's seen as being a Republic of China savior kind of person. And that's why I think Junyi's right that Guo overlaps a little bit with Han. But I think few of them would still vote for Guo in the end if he's not the official candidate. I think for much of this campaign, the discussion has been about who's going to be the candidate. And the fact that we're still having that discussion, I think is one factor why we don't have a clear issue. Maybe we've also seen issues emerging, but then kind of being resolved. For example, I think the Me Too movement was a really interesting case. It had a potential to drag on and be quite damaging to either of the political parties. But I think it was quite interesting, the fact that basically there was both parties actually worked together to allow that legislation to go through. We don't know how successful that legislation is going to be, but I think it's an interesting mark of the way that democracy works in Taiwan, that the political system did try and respond to those issues quite quickly. Yeah, that's a kind of a short answer to both of those questions.
Thank you for the question on Thailand and public sentiment and why there were no protests. There were small-scale protests in the immediate aftermath of that sort of frustration of the popular will to have move forward, lead a government. But it seems to me that never gained momentum, and one may speculate about why that is. One clue to it might be that even though there's a great deal of frustration and disappointment among people who had very high hopes for seeing this new sort of radical progressive party in government, changing things, shaking things up, the party itself seems to take a rather sort of long view. The time is not ripe, perhaps, so they didn't throw themselves behind any such sort of mobilizations or movements as far as I could tell. So my suspicion is that they are playing a long game. They are looking forward to using their position in parliament, in parliamentary committees, and so on and so forth, to show, like they did over the previous period between 2019 and this year, like they really shone in Parliament by scrutinizing corrupt ministers and dodgy deals and so on and so forth. And that's part of why they gained so much momentum. So rather than going out on the streets and raising hell and sort of trying to topple the government, the strategy they seem to have adopted is that let's look forward to the next election and not burn a lot of energy and potentially ruin a lot of people's lives by taking to the streets. So in 2020 and 2021, we saw a lot of protests in Bangkok, youthful protests that wanted to get rid of Prayut Chan-o-cha and ended up making much more ambitious demands as well, reform of the monarchy and so on and so forth. And a lot of the leaders of that movement have sort of been taken care of by the judicial apparatus. So the leaders of that movement that came out in the frustration over Future Forward Party, so the earlier incarnation of Move Forward, when that was banned and dissolved, right? That triggered massive protests. This time, well, the party hasn't been quite dissolved yet, but that might be sort of a second shoe to drop, and we'll see what happens then. So if there are to be protests now, I'm wondering if it might not come from the sort of the old yellow shirts, rather than from the supporters of Move Forward. We can see that one scheme that is currently sort of the Pheu Thai's central policy that they ran on was to transfer 10,000 baht into a digital wallet. I'm not quite sure what that is, of every adult citizen of Thailand. And that is now sort of making lots of people worried about the fiscal wiseness of doing such a thing and the technical feasibility and all kinds of problems, right? And we can see sort of an old playbook. I mean, sort of we've seen this movie before. It starts with appeals and petitions to courts, to various independent agencies and so on and so forth. And eventually, perhaps, if there are sort of corruption scandals and so on and so forth, it can ignite this sort of anti-corruption type sentiment. So that's sort of another thing to maybe keep an eye open for in the future. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much to all our speakers and to all of you for joining us this afternoon. Please stop and have a glass of wine or lemonade before making your way back out into hopefully a slightly less rainy night. Thank you very much.